That's great. All right, we are recording. Oh, that's interesting. Why didn't it ask me? Well, we're recording, so I'm not going to try to puzzle it out at the moment. All right, now our topic for this session is engaging activities, and very specifically, what are the kinds of things that you and your student, that you can have your students do during this time that can be high impact, that can motivate and engage them, but that can fit within the constraints and parameters we are certainly experiencing and imposing both on ourselves as well as being imposed upon us by the limitations of the situation. So we're going to do that in a couple of different ways. Before I get to the content, let me mention I've got a resource here at this website. This is everything that my team has been compiling and preparing on the topic of teaching from home. So the kinds of tools and resources you might need, some ideas and strategies, and a great many other things can be found at that site. It's not a terribly complex site. We've got 5 topics that kind of guide everything, so it's kind of organized that way. But then we also just have a page of additional resources that teachers have been finding very helpful. And as we encounter more things, we add them to the site as well. One thing that we're not tracking directly, but we're certainly happy to share, so you might want to just reach out to us anytime. We have noticed most of the premier ed tech tools out there are offering free premium access right now. And some of them require like having a coupon code or having access to a special link, those kinds of things. And we're trying to kind of just keep that stuff available. So if you have questions about those things specifically and you don't see what you want on this site, feel free to reach out and we might be able to share even more with you that way as well. Now, what guides our reflection on the topic of how to teach from home well are these 5 principles. And for those of you who have already been part of a presentation, I'm not going to go into it in too much depth, but just as a reminder that we find the most important thing in all of this is the connection point, the touch point with students. And largely because we can accomplish very little if we don't have a safe and secure connection with the student already, virtually, digitally. It creates a comfortability. It also creates a familiarity with the experience and the process. And so we want to try to connect as much as possible. And in doing that, it opens the door to accomplish something with an activity or with an experience that we can engage our students in more readily. So that's, of course, the first line. And when we're doing that effectively, the other things are going to be more effective as well. So beyond that, we're going to be focusing most of our attention on numbers 3 and 4, especially number 4 there. You can see focus on engaging activities. So the priority here being how to do something that is engaging, but that does not ask too much of yourselves and your students, and beyond. So we'll get into that here in just a moment. Before we do, another quick reflection. Again, this is review for most of you, if not all of you, in some capacity. You hear me talk about this a lot because I am a firm believer that the work done around this idea is proving to be some of the most impactful in teaching and learning because it applies to everything you do all the time with every dynamic, whether you teach kindergarten or 12th grade, whether you teach music or ELA or otherwise. So, and whether you're in administration or social worker, everything. So Dave Stewart Jr., all of his work found at davestewartjr.com. You can see the spelling of his name at the bottom of the book picture there. And this book by itself is, I believe, one of the most foundational reads that I've experienced in the last decade in the field of education. And certainly practical because he is a classroom teacher. So he shares a lot of ideas of what things look like specifically in a classroom, but also weighty pedagogically. So he does a lot of research. That's kind of, he talks about reading, like the best thing we can do as human beings is read in terms of like learning and such. And so this is the kind of person who it seems like he reads 1 billion books a year. I don't know how he does it. Well, I kind of know how he does it because he actually writes about that, which is great. But anyway, so point being, our students hold beliefs about these 5 things at all times, and we can impact those beliefs by the things we do and say. And it's harder to do that now than it was with students in the classroom, but it's even more important now because we can't engage our students well if they don't have secure beliefs in terms of these categories. If they don't feel that we care and are passionate, which is a large part of number one there, credibility, then it's not likely they're going to be too concerned about how engaging the activities that we're trying to do or have them do. If they don't see something as valuable, if they don't see that they belong in that kind of work, people like them care about things like this. That's the belonging idea. And of course, number 4 and 5, if they don't feel like it's worth the effort, like it's not going to better them in some way, and if they don't feel like they can be successful, which is efficacy, then we're not likely to achieve anything with the activity, regardless of how compelling it might be or how interesting we think that the experience could be. So we got to start here. And it always begins, and this is why we mentioned the connection point earlier, it always begins with a direct connection with your student. And especially something regular and intentional, and it does not have to be academic. So to most clearly influence how students feel about the work that they're doing, we need to maintain that connection. And I think, as I talked previously, one of the things Dave has mentioned in his work recently, since we began this quarantine situation, is that we need to try to connect with students in a way that is comfortable for them as much as possible. So it's good to have the face-to-face, like what we're doing right now. This kind of thing is really good, but for many of our students, it's not super comfortable. And so it doesn't always influence our credibility when we force them into our boxes for things. And so he's not conclusive on how he feels about this directly yet, except for that he thinks that we should be mindful of, if students want, and they might tell us this, if we've asked them and they say, I'd prefer like comments in Google Classroom over phone calls, then obviously we want to try to honor that. But we also want to maintain as authentic of a connection as we can, which is an influence both on that and on as real, if this face-to-face face-to-face experience is still closer to real than, texting and so on. So all of that to say, if you're going to do engaging things or have your students do engaging things, you need to start here, because it's not going to matter how engaging the experience is if your students don't see value in it or don't feel that you care and are passionate about the thing you're asking them to do, that kind of stuff. All right, let's break it down. So first, what makes something engaging? This is obviously not anything new. The research is all basically the same. It's always the same, and it has been for decades. The kinds of things that make an experience engaging for anyone, if not everyone, is first and foremost that we feel like it's meaningful and personal. And that goes back to that value belief that if I believe that something is worthwhile, and a large part of what makes it worthwhile is that I care about it in some way. So if I see that, then I'm more likely to engage with it. It will feel more engaging for the student and certainly be thus. The second part of this is autonomy and control. Your students are going to be autonomous more than ever in this experience because of the nature of the times. However, we run into a problem as educators. Personally, I feel this way, and I certainly know that some do and some don't. So I'm not going to put anyone into a box here, but in a situation like this, we feel the need to try to structure and control things more because they are so unstructured and because they are so unpredictable with the nature of things. And the problem here is if we try to structure something that by nature is not something we can effectively structure and control during this time, then a good example of that is if we try to tell students to do their work at a certain time and we try to hold them accountable to that, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Why shouldn't a student be allowed to work at 10 o'clock p.m. instead of 10 o'clock a.m., that kind of thing. So we want to be mindful of how much autonomy we're still allowing them to have in a natural sense. And that, that may or may not even have crossed your mind yet. But it is something that influences the nature of the engagement. So if we're asking them to do things, does it matter when they do it? Does it matter in what way they do it? All of those kinds of things. And how much of the student's perception of control is present and can we allow to be present? How much do they see they can make choices and be successful in their choices and those kinds of things? So the last part there is just the nature of how we do it. Grades are doing things right. Mastery is doing things well, long term. And so the mindset of we want to aspire toward mastering something as opposed to getting a good grade on something. Well, the interesting thing now is we don't really have to worry so much about grades on the whole. That's one of the things that's kind of been taken off the table during this time. All that to say, it's unfamiliar territory as well. So we want to focus on whatever it is we're asking students to do right now. We want to focus on having the students just try to engage well with the activity. And that may take a bit of nuance in order to convey that, because especially your older students, if you're talking about like secondary students, they're going to be looking for how do I check the boxes and just get it done kind of thing. They tend to do that no matter what, but they're especially going to be doing that during a time like this. And so we want to think about that. Like, what is it that we're conveying to students that measures that this is a successful experience? And we want to focus on that, doing it well, as opposed to doing it right, or as opposed to checking the box. Okay, those are some of the factors that significantly influence something's engagement. Now let's talk more specifically about the approaches. And this is where these are just models or structures that have already been designed in some capacity, or pedagogies that are designed around those motivating factors, what makes something engaging. And so we know that problem-based, project-based, and inquiry learning are all more high engagement experiences than some traditional models or structures in teaching and learning. So I want to try to convey what these look like during a time like this, some of the basic tenets of these things, and give a few examples about each one. This is difficult. This is difficult because it depends largely on what you do and how you do it and what age your students are, as to obviously what the examples would look like here. So in addition to the examples I'm going to provide, which are few, I have a number of resources that provide many more examples and are like filterable by grade or by content or kind of activity, that kind of thing. So I'll direct you to those resources as well after I share a few things here. First, in terms of problem-based learning, the main parts of this concept are as follows. I got a few for each of these. So problem-based learning matters when we find real problems and we have the problem define what we're learning or when we're learning and things like that. During a time like this, it makes the most sense to just focus on the problem and not try to teach very little. And I'll give a few examples of that in a moment. But because the students are just at home, because they have very different kinds of environments depending on where they live and with whom they live, the kinds of problems are going to vary as to how much they might appeal to a student. So some of this flexibility matters. We'll come back to that. Then, of course, with problem-based learning, the importance is not on finding the right process to solve the problem as much as it is on finding a way to solve the problem and then being able to share how you arrive at a solution. So if the problem drives the experience, then really the goal here is to try to find a solution, try to figure out a way to do it, and then be able to share that. And that's kind of the third part, is being able to learn from different approaches to the problem, being able to learn from different ways of arriving at a solution, or even potentially arriving at different kinds of solutions. And so some way to capture and share that with peers, with real people, not just with the teacher, and some kind of reflection component. So these are the fundamental things that you see in problem-based learning. What does that look like during a situation like now? Here's one example, the chocolate milk ratios project. This came from, we've got the link to it. I'll mention later. I can't remember exactly what the source was here at the moment, but it's like a 6th grade math problem is where the content started, and dealing with ratios. And so then it's like how much milk to chocolate or chocolate to milk makes a good glass of chocolate milk. And it's a poster project kind of thing. So the students would hypothetically just kind of design a poster, but in this situation, have the students really do it, at home if they have chocolate and milk. And trying to arrive at you know, what ratio do you use and what's the result? And in a situation like this, if you have anyone else at home who's willing to try your concoction, then you can get feedback and, you know, share that feedback. Really, it's a simple experience, but the goal here is to try to work with ratios in some capacity. And so obviously you can do that with any kind of like drink related thing, you know, that stuff is really low hanging fruit in that sense, but you can do food in a lot of different kinds of situations. And I think that's one example that comes up a lot when we see this, you know, having students do something with food. As a matter of fact, I have a couple of other examples there. Another one would be to organize a room. You could do this hypothetically. So pick a room in your house. Think about area, right? So we could do this with perimeter and area. You could do this with, you know, those kinds of problems, but have them pick a room and then measuring the kinds of things that are in the room, try to like organize for a certain goal. And the student can come up with the goal. Maybe it's for efficiency. Maybe it's for ease of movement from one point to another in the room. Maybe it's for ease of access to a certain thing that's in the room, you know, center the room on something, but have them hypothetically design a room, you know, get out some paper and draw it out, something like that. Measure things if they have a way to measure things so they can get actual scale dimensions, all of that kind of stuff. And essentially you know, you can provide the goal or you can have them come up with the goal, but that problem of how to make the room more efficient or how to make it, you know, something is what drives the experience and the learning in that sense. More in a minute. So project-based learning is similar to problem-based learning, but oriented around a larger scale most of the time, not necessarily in this situation, as you might guess. Within project-based learning, the main goal is that you're doing something real. And so we just talked about a couple of examples that could be project-based learning as much as they are problem-based learning, depending on how you orient yourself. Usually, I'll just mention that usually the real thing you're doing is in answer to a compelling question. It tends to be what drives the thinking in project-based learning. So whatever you are doing could be different from someone else as long as it is in response to that compelling question. So as a teacher, I think about the question first, and then in most instances, I allow the result to be more flexible so students can come up with a different way to answer that question or to experience that topic. And then the audience matters here in as many ways as possible, trying to do whatever you're doing, trying to do it for people, and usually try to do it for real people, not just hypothetically or not just sharing something digitally, you know, trying to actually do a thing for someone in some way. And I'll give examples about that. And then as much as possible for students to be able to speak into the experience. And that's one of the driving factors here whenever you talk about project-based learning, whether in a situation like now or otherwise. You can provide as little or as much guidance as you want in an experience like this, but the more guidance you provide and the less students choose during the process, the more confined the experience becomes. And so we talked earlier about engagement has a lot to do with whether students feel like it's meaningful and they're autonomous. And so if you can provide more flexibility there, especially if the flexibility includes how students find meaning in the experience, that matters. Let me give a couple of examples. So we mentioned the organize a room thing. Have them actually do it is kind of the difference here. So problem-based learning is try to organize a room. Project-based learning, you know, if they actually do the organization, recreate a room, does anyone in the house allow them to do that? You know, if they can, maybe just their bedroom, if it's a room that they have more control over. But that's definitely a step in the right direction. However, you know, the outcome, so all of this is assuming the same kind of outcome. So maybe instead of something that quite that confined, you could have something a little bit more open, like they're going to write and send letters to real people for certain reasons. So think about your topic first. What is it that we're trying to reflect on or engage with in terms of a topic? And is there opportunity for students to communicate tangibly with real people on that topic? To somehow extend the experience. And so then actually have them do it is the key there. And this next example is a little bit more open-ended too, where in so many instances in project-based learning, the end result is you're doing something for someone to help them in some way. So again, start with your question, start with your topic, and have the end result be on the student to come up with, how can I answer this question by doing something for someone. And maybe that's a family member, maybe that's a neighbor. Right now, the interactions are limited, but it's not impossible. You know, that the thing you're doing doesn't have to be social. So you know, if it's related to like helping with their property or cleaning something, you know, that kind of thing. So the key here being whatever my topic is guides, you know, that question guides what students might do. And if it makes sense, if it's possible, ask the question and then allow the end result, the answer to the question, to be a bit more open-ended. So some of these examples I gave are more confined. You know, that's a specific result that I'm asking students to do. Instead of that, it might be, here's a problem or here's a question. What can you do to engage with that or to help resolve it? And so maybe the students will choose to help someone, maybe they'll choose to write or send letters, you know, so then they might actually do other kinds of things. Many teachers find when they do something like project-based learning, especially in a situation like this where we don't have quite the same level of intense engagement with something because we just aren't together. Many find that if I provide like a list of, here are a few ways you can engage with this, some examples of how students can do something in answer to the question, that tends to help. But I almost always want to do so with the caveat of students can choose other things that are not on the list if they, you know, run them by me first. So what are the steps involved in this? I should just mention so that it's not so we don't miss out on, you know, some of the necessary factors. You definitely want to start a project-based learning experience. Always begins with something, some kind of interesting or interest building experience. And in a situation like this, that could be trying to have like a guest present virtually to your students. That could be a video that's just compelling, you know, those kinds of things. But really, you want to start with something to get students thinking about the topic, and it needs to be simple and concise because you don't have a lot of time to devote to that. And then from there, you present the topic or the question. The next step is brainstorming. What is it that we can do to address this? What are the things that we need to know more about to accomplish that? And those are the two questions that then guide what you might do. And, you know, all of it being bite size right now because we don't have the time resources to devote to something really expansive. In terms of, oh, I wanted to mention this one too because we came back to food earlier. Have students, you know, make dinner if it connects to the content in some way. You know, you can be the one who makes the meal yours or prepares the food and such, depending on what, you know, what's going on. Those kinds of things are something that most students have access to in some way, and many of them are already doing things like that too. So make it connect already, and then, you know, it's as real as it gets when they're already participating in something. They're already going to need to do it. Might as well just take advantage of that. Inquiry learning, on the other hand, is oh, by the way, there's a possibility we might get interrupted at some point here. This happened to a group I was with previously once. So if so, I'll just send a quick email with a link to jump back in if we get kicked out, FYI, but I think we'll actually wrap up before that were to happen as well. Okay, so inquiry learning is the idea of questions driving the experience, and the key factors here being students are the ones asking or generating the questions. So usually it starts with some kind of topic, and the teacher gives the topic, and the students start to come up with questions, and then the students pursue, see if I get this right here, individual and divergent lines of inquiry. So if I provide the topic as the teacher and the students start coming up with questions, the goal here being, come up with a question about that that's interesting to you, and then you pursue that line of inquiry. And that's what makes it divergent. The students are going different directions with it, hopefully under kind of a certain umbrella is the idea. That's the goal there. And then the key to making it something interesting is that the students are sharing what they're looking into, the questions, their wonderings, their curiosity. They're sharing that in simple ways, so it's not laborious. They're not creating these projects. They're just simply sharing and often, sharing simply and often. So let me give you a couple of quick examples tangibly here. Start with the fact. The sun gives energy. A very simple fact. The sun gives energy. And then have the students ask the questions. So what questions do you have about that? What do you want to know more about that? What can we learn under that topic, and have them roll with it. Start with a topic instead of a fact. Oh, by the way, I should mention with the fact one, something that's kind of arbitrary, not arbitrary, that's like vague or uncertain, like, you know, a fact that's kind of unclear and confusing can be a good thing with some students and can be a bad thing with other students. So, especially ages matter there. The more tangible it is for younger students, it helps. The more kind of odd or, it's confusing or complicated, I guess is a better word, the more complex the fact is for older students, the oftentimes helps them. And then you start with a topic instead of a fact. Our topic for this inquiry experience is how things gain energy. And then students can go asking questions, or they're always starting with students asking questions. Start with a result or a solution. And so instead of, go with the end product. And then have students work their way backwards. Like, how did that happen? What are some questions you have about how to arrive at that solution? All of those kinds of things. Using structures like digital structures for students to be able to share their questions initially, so they see the questions, as well as for students to be able to come back to that and update it regularly. So if we can have something like a Padlet or even like a Google Slides where we have different slides for each question, and you're posting the things you're finding, you're sharing what you're learning, those kinds of things. Flipgrid's another good example of a way to structure some of that. Okay, some honorable mentions here. Other kinds of ways to engage students. Now, I want to be clear on the fun factor, which is we should not be trying to compete with anything else that is entertaining your students right now, because you'll lose the competition. Your work is not as fun for your students as Netflix and their video games and their social media in most senses. And I'm not saying that to criticize anything as much as, I mean, how can we compete with Hollywood? How can we compete with the video game industry? And so we shouldn't try to. Which means we do want to have things be interesting and such, but entertainment value is not a good way to try to gauge whether something's engaging, because in most instances it might be somewhat entertaining, but it is not entertaining enough to be more entertaining than alternative options. So by the way, I'm noticing Robin's comment there. Thank you, Robin. That's great. Finding a recipe to do with, because you have this ingredient. So if you didn't see Robin's comment in the chat box, you should definitely look it out, because it's a great example. Here's this ingredient that we have access to, but what can you do with it? And there's the problem. And now the solution is I'm going to try to come up with a recipe, or I'm going to try to create something that actually, works. That's a great idea. I love that, Robin. So a couple of alternatives to adding some amount of a fun factor that could be beneficial. The gamification concept is the idea of you make a game out of the entire experience. So for the next 8 weeks, we're going to do these kinds of things, and it doesn't matter what the things we're going to do, but you as students can earn points for doing X, Y, and Z types of things. We'll tally the points, and at the end I'll mail a king size candy bar to the top 5 people. Like things like that, where there's a clear prize at the end, and it doesn't have to be, it can be ubiquitous. You can have the prize be something everyone earns, especially if it's like you have to get a certain number of points and then you earn the prize, so everyone can get it. You can create the whole leveling system. So if you do enough to get certain points, you get a new level. And if you get a new level, you get to have these kinds of things, all that kind of stuff. So gamification has some value in a situation like this, because it just creates another way to see progress, which is valuable, and especially a way to see progress that's interesting to students. The Genius Hour concept, obviously the hour is not relevant anymore, but the Genius Hour concept of find something you're interested in, learn about it, teach us about it, or make something that teaches us about it. And it doesn't have to be related to the content we're studying, that kind of thing. That's great. And then the design process, anytime. So Makerspace popularized design thinking and design process, and then STEM and STEAM ran with it, and now it's just everywhere. So the idea of, here's the thing, make something, prototype it, see if it can solve the problem, or see if it can do the function you want it to do, and reiterate. If it doesn't do it, try to remake it and such. So whatever the stuff is that you have at home lying around your house, put it to use is kind of the idea here, especially if it's like recyclables or garbage, stuff that otherwise wouldn't be useful. Or if you have, if your students have toys like Legos or things like that they're really excited about, put them to use in designing things related to a topic. And you can approach that in a lot of different ways. I'm not going to go into it in much depth right now, but that could be a conversation, follow-up conversation too. So fundamentally, um, I wanted to share some examples of things, but we have a ton more resources that give you specific examples in content areas and age levels on that website, the resources site. So the Teach Home Hub bit.ly there that you see. And then more specifically, because these things are nuanced to your context and your students and your work, I would love to follow up with you. You've got our email there, as well as my email is just zripley@cbdconsulting.com. And then you can call or text that number. But our virtual coach resource is key for this time and experience, because the question of, I want to do something like this, but I don't know what it looks like in my situation, we can address that question more specifically and much more effectively one-to-one via the virtual coach. So I highly encourage use of that. And if there are other needs or questions that arise, you can just always feel free to reach out to us, even if it's just, this is the thing I'm doing and I'm just curious about a second opinion, or I just want someone else to see it and give me some feedback. So any of those kinds of things, and we are available nonstop during this time. Happy to help. Now, I'm going to end the recording, and there's a very good chance that we'll get kicked out of the room here suddenly